John had always been a bit of a recluse. He was a solitary man who didn't have many friends and preferred to keep to himself. But his situation became even more extreme when he lost his job and his apartment, all in the same week. With nowhere else to turn, he found himself sneaking into the attic of an old family house. The family who owned the house lived downstairs, and John had managed to avoid detection for weeks. At first, he thought he was just passing through, a temporary stop on his way to something better, but as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, John became increasingly comfortable in his secret hideout. He had a small cot and a few personal belongings, but the rest of his living space was made up of old furniture and boxes filled with memories of the family who owned the house. John knew he was living a lie, but he couldn't help himself. He was fascinated by the family and spent hours watching them through a small hole in the ceiling. He learned their routines, their quirks, and their secrets. He felt like he knew them better than they knew themselves, and it gave him a sense of power he had never felt before. But one day, something changed. John was watching the family from his perch when he saw something he wasn't supposed to see, something so dark and twisted that it made him question everything he thought he knew about the people he had been spying on. He didn't know what to do with the information, but he knew he had to keep watching. He had to know more. Over the next few days, John became obsessed with the family's secret. He watched them closely, waiting for any sign that would confirm what he had seen. And eventually, he got his chance. Late one night, he saw the family sneaking out of the house and into the woods. He followed them, staying just far enough behind that they wouldn't see him. After a while, they came to a clearing, and John watched in horror as they began to perform a dark ritual. It was clear that this was something they had done before, something they had been doing for years. And as John watched, he realized that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than he ever could have imagined. John knew he had to get out of there, and fast. But as he tried to back away quietly, he stepped on a twig, and the sound echoed through the silent night. Suddenly, all eyes turned to him, and John realized that he had been caught. The family members surrounded him, their eyes glowing in the moonlight. John knew he was in trouble, but he couldn't bring himself to regret what he had done. He had uncovered their secret, and he had to pay the price. As the family closed in, John felt a sense of relief. At least now he wouldn't have to keep living this lie, this twisted existence in the attic. And as they dragged him away, John couldn't help but wonder what other secrets were waiting to be uncovered. John's heart raced as he was dragged through the woods. By the family, he had never been so scared in his life. He had no idea what they were going to do to him, but he knew it couldn't be good. He struggled against them, trying to break free, but it was no use. They were too strong. Finally, they arrived at a small cabin deep in the woods. It was old and run down, with no electricity or running water. John was thrown inside and left alone in the dark. He could hear the family members talking outside, their voices low and ominous. He knew they were planning something, and it made his blood run cold as the night wore on. John began to lose track of time. He was alone with his thoughts, and they weren't pleasant ones. He wondered if he would ever see the light of day again, if he would ever be able to leave this cabin and go back to his old life. He knew the answer was no. Hours turned into days, and John was left alone in the cabin with nothing to do but think. He thought about the family, about their dark secret, about what they were planning to do to him. He tried to come up with a plan to escape, but every idea he had was thwarted by the family's watchful eyes. One day, John was surprised to hear a voice coming from outside the cabin. It was a young girl's voice, and it sounded scared. John couldn't make out what she was saying, but he knew he had to investigate. He crept to the window and peeked out, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The family was gathered around a young girl, no older than 10 years old. She was crying and shaking, and they were holding her down. John could hear them chanting, their voices low and menacing. He realized with horror that they were preparing to sacrifice her. Without thinking, John burst out of the cabin and ran towards the family, screaming at them to stop. They turned to him, their faces twisted with rage. John knew he had made a mistake, but it was too late. They were on him in an instant, and he felt a sharp pain in his chest. As he lay dying on the ground, John realized the family's secret. They were a cult, and they had been sacrificing people for years. They had taken him and because they thought he would make a good sacrifice, and they had been right. In his last moments, John thought about his life, about the choices he had made that had led him to this point. He knew he had made mistakes, but he never thought he would end up like this. As he took his last breath, John realized that the family's secret was bigger than he ever could have imagined, and he had paid the ultimate price for uncovering it. The family had successfully hidden their dark secret for years, but John's rival had threatened to expose them. They had no choice but to eliminate him, but they knew that they had to cover up his disappearance to avoid suspicion. They buried John's body in a shallow grave deep in the woods and went about their lives as if nothing had happened. The police never found any evidence of foul play, and John was simply declared missing. But as time passed, the family members began to feel the weight of what they had done. They couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, that someone knew their secret. They started to see visions of John, his ghost haunting them from beyond the grave. The young girl who had almost been sacrificed had been traumatized by the experience. She couldn't forget the face of the man who had saved her life, and she knew that she had to do something to make things right. One day, she went to the police and told them everything. She told them about the cult, about their secret, and about John's murder. The police were skeptical at first, but they decided to investigate. What they found shocked them to the core. The family's house was filled with evidence of their dark deeds. There were altars, sacrificial knives, and bones scattered throughout the house. The police arrested the family members and charged them with murder and cult activity. As the trial began, the young girl took the stand and testified about what she had seen. The family members denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury found them guilty on all counts, and they were sentenced to life in prison. But even with the family members behind bars, the town couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. There were rumors that the family's house was haunted, that John's ghost still roamed the attic. One day, a group of teenagers decided to break into the house and see for themselves. They climbed up to the attic and were shocked to find that it was still filled with John's possessions. It was as if he had never left. As they were leaving, one of the teenagers heard a whisper in his ear. He turned around, but there was no one there. He shrugged it off, but as they were driving away, they saw a figure in the window. It was John's ghost, watching them as they left. From that day on, the town avoided the family's house. They knew that something was still there, something dark and terrifying. John's ghost continued to haunt the attic, and the town never forgot the horror that had taken place there. And so the family's dark secret was finally exposed, but at a terrible cost. John had paid with his life, and the town had been scarred forever. But his sacrifice had ultimately led to the truth being revealed and justice being served.